I'm going to ask you a question, okay? Here it is. What is the one historical event that has directly impacted your life the most? Was it the death of Jesus? Was it the American Revolution? Perhaps the assassination of JFK? Whatever event that you're thinking of, though, it's probably not the Industrial Revolution. And that is the answer we should all be saying. I mean, look at what we're doing right now. You're watching a video or listening to a podcast. I'm somewhere else. At the moment that you're listening to this, I am off doing something somewhere else. And you can watch this back a couple times. You can download it. You can watch it backwards if you wanted to. You can send it to someone else. That's a very powerful technology to have. Something that is very recent. Something that really is life-changing. And it's the result of the Industrial Revolution. Now, for all the good that the Industrial Revolution brought, though, there was a lot of bad. Because when you have something like an Industrial Revolution, well, what comes along? A lot of change. A lot of change. People's lives change, people's incomes change, businesses change, forms of government change. And with all that change, there's a lot of chaos. Now, one of the countries that particularly resisted all of this change was Russia. And this would be one of the many factors that made Russia particularly susceptible to revolution. But more on that in a moment. Hello everyone, I am Erick Alden. Welcome to Our Dark History, where we discuss the darkest people, places, and events in human history. Today, we are going to be taking a look at the big issues that the Russian Empire was facing, because going into the 1900s, really, every other country was, making some decent progress. Some more than others, not everyone could be a UK or a Germany, but Russia really lagged behind. I mean, they were struggling for a long time there. And the Tsar, you would have one Tsar that made a little bit of progress, and then you would have the next one reverse all his policies. And, let's go back to the medieval times, right? So it was just this really tough situation. And it really made revolution not just possible, not just likely, but inevitable. That's really important. So we're going to be looking at all of that. So without any further ado, let's get right on in to the video. So one of the big issues that the Russian Empire was facing, and again, this all goes back to, they were not willing to change. They were not willing to embrace new forms of, just new ways of doing things. And this applied as much to economics as it did to the government that they wanted, as it applied to the way specific industries worked. Their military was even kind of outdated, right? Going into World War I, they were doing stuff that was used before the Napoleonic times, right? Technology and cavalry and, all these different things. And it would turn out to be a really bad thing. But the one thing that really made revolution very possible was that they were so loosely governed. The government, for all its faults, it really did not govern well enough. The taxes weren't collected enough. There weren't enough officers on the ground. Sometimes when you control so much land, it's like you can't control it all. Look at the Russian Empire on a map. It is insanely huge. It's ginormous. Even modern day Russia is a behemoth. Now, granted, most of that land is uninhabited, but there are rural communities here and there that, some of them have existed for centuries. And the Russian Empire, they're even worse. Everyone was living in rural areas back then. It was over 80% of the population. Today, it's almost, it's closer to being switched, right? People are moving to cities more now than ever. But back then, during this time, like the late 1800s, early 1900s, people were still living very rural lifestyles, self-sustaining farmers. That's what everyone was supposed to be. Because that was the only way you were going to live. Now, the next big fact, which I found completely insane. I had to fact check this from like 5 different places, but it's actually true, which is so insane. Roughly 9,000 state police officers were responsible for governing all of the Russian Empire. Now, of course, that excludes the cities, right? You know, your Moscows, your St. Petersburgs, your Odessas. They had some additional police officers because they're just, the internal dynamics are a little bit different in a city. But there were, for all the rest of the territory outside of those cities, like we're talking tens of thousands of miles. I mean, again, go look at the Russian Empire on a map. It is a monster. I mean, it's like the size of an actual continent. I mean, it's just insane. And there were about 9,000 police officers to keep the law and order everywhere, all the time. That's just so insane. I couldn't even believe it. So that puts the citizen to police officer ratio at 1 to 11,000. Because let's remember, there were like over 100 million people living in Russia at the time. And that also included different people groups. So it wasn't just the Russians. You know, the Russians were the dominant people in the Russian Empire. But there were sizable minorities of Jews, of other Slavic groups, of all these other, you know, groups and religions. I mean, there were a whole segment of Muslims. I mean, it was, believe it or not, the Russian Empire was very diverse, actually. Oddly enough, you know, looking back at some of these historical examples, you don't think you'd find diverse societies, but, well, you know, here they are. Russian Empire was one of them. But here was the problem with the loose governance. They had really regressive policies that punished the peasants and rewarded the nobility. That was the way their government worked. Because the elites, you know, the people that were friends with the Tsar, they were able to get the Tsar to pass policies that were good for their businesses, good for their schools, good for their communities. And, well, if you were a peasant, well, you don't really have any representation. You just live under the Tsar. That's it. The Tsar's going to tell you what to do. You're going to do it, or they're going to, you know, send you to the Gulag. Well, not the Gulag. The Gulag would, believe it or not, the Russian Empire's Siberian work camps were actually fairly tolerable in comparison to the Soviet Gulag a couple years later. But more on that in another video. The Tsar was going to tell you what to do, though. And if you didn't do it, you were going to be sent off somewhere. You were going to be arrested. You were going to be prosecuted. And, well, again, you know, you can't really legally fight the Tsar on this. I mean, so just to give you a little bit of a wacky example here. If the Tsar one day woke up and decided that everyone is going to call the sky the color purple, well, that was how they were going to do it. Right? If the Tsar wakes up one day, yeah, the sky is definitely purple. It's always been purple. It'll always be purple. And if you say otherwise, well, I'm going to arrest you. I'm going to send you to some kind of work camp in Siberia. And that's going to be the end of that. No one's going to challenge me anymore on that because, well, all the people that did get sent away. See you later, dude. And that's just kind of the way it was for a very, very long time. And you know, you multiply that kind of governance with, you know, loose governance. I mean, you can be harsh or you can be loose, but seeing the way the Russian Empire was harsh and loose at the same time, it's just weird. Because you could do some crime, you're right? You could do whatever it is you wanted, but the second you get caught, man, that's the end. That is the end, because they're going to prosecute you to the full extent of the law. And there was not going to be much you could do to defend yourself, legally or otherwise. So there's another big threat that the Russian Empire faced. And this was something that a lot of European nations at the time were experiencing, but it was particularly bad in Russia because they just had so many different people groups, so many different languages spoken and cultures and religions and ethnicities, right? I mean, so many different people. Now, the one important one the one really important one, Poland. Because Poland was very sizable. At one point, they had a nation of their own, right? The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And, well, Poland saved Europe. There's all these... I feel really bad for the Polish people. Because they're always like, well, Poland came in and saved Europe from this or that, and then they got partitioned. And that happens 2 or 3 times, which is kind of sad because Poland kind of did save Europe a couple times. And they did get partitioned and get their land stolen. I'm happy for them that they got a nation today, but during this time, man, it was rough. Because they were a distinct people group from the Russians. They were distinct from the Germans. They were just this weird in-between that they had their own language, they had their own group, culture, their whole own way of life. But they didn't have independence. And they were ruled by someone who, would send them to a Siberian work camp if you got out of line. And it's a really rough way to live. Really not a good way to do things. But, Then there were the Jews. Now, there was a sizable minority of Jews in Russia at the time. So many. So they exercised a lot of influence in Russia. Because, you see, the history of the Jewish people is very interesting. They kind of bounce back and forth between a couple of different countries. And one of the dominant places that Judaism took a hold is that Eastern European part, right? What is today Poland? Because, so there was the Polish question, and then there was the Jewish question, because the Jews were right next to the Poles, right? In fact, a lot of the people that were resistant and against the Russian Empire were Polish Jews. So you had this really weird situation where it's like a minority group within a minority group within a majority group. They didn't have any representation. They were ruled by someone that was from a different ethnicity, that was from a different religion, that had a different culture. At a certain point you have to ask, why is some Russian czar telling some Polish Jew how to live his life? These people were, a lot of times they were just happened to be born in the Russian Empire. It's just kind of like bad luck. And then they're looking at some of the other nation states, and they're like, man, why can't we be more like, over there they have independence. Their people group can rule themselves. Why can't we be more like that? And that's where this whole thread of nationalism comes from. People looking and saying, hey, we're one race, we should be together, we should stick together and have our own way of life. Right? And then there were the Ukrainians, and they were another sizable minority because, man, the Ukrainians, they had a rough history, especially looking at what happened under the Soviet Union and the Holodomor and the genocide, and it was just horrible what happened to the Ukrainians then. But during this time, they were just in a similar situation. They wanted independence from the Russians. They couldn't get They couldn't get it, though. There was no legal or other thing that they could really do to, really set themselves free. It was just like, you're going to live under the big fist of the Tsar, and that's going to be it. Really rough way to live your life. And so you had these, and these are just some of the most prominent examples. You had other nationalistic groups of people within the Russian Empire that wanted independence. Whole bunch of others. These are just some of the most important examples here. But when you have so many groups of people in your country that are like, yeah, I kind of want out. Well, kind of tough to keep everything together. If you're constantly having to appease people or keep people in, or there's some kind of racial hatred going on between people, because that definitely happened. A lot of the problems that led to the genocide of the Ukrainians under the Soviet Union, well, a lot of that was this ethno-nationalism. They thought that, the Ukrainians were inferior Slavic people. So it didn't really matter if the Ukrainians died. They're less. They're not as important. They're not as good as we are. And, it's just this horrible thing that happened. Horrible stuff. And then the one really bad issue that the Russian Empire had was this inferiority complex to Western nations. Now, this is something that's always kind of existed. And so real quick tangent. I think the reason that the Russian Empire and Russia overall has struggled to keep up with the West is because of the Mongolian invasion in the 1300s, right? Genghis Khan. Because Russia is very accessible to, you can go from Mongolia to Russia real quick with a horse and invade. Like, it's happened quite a few times. It wasn't just the Mongolians, it was also the Huns, Attila the Hun. I mean, that goes back to, I think, Roman times even then. But when you are so susceptible to foreigners coming in and invading, that really makes it difficult for your country to prosper, to really grow. And I don't think they ever recovered from the Mongolian invasion in the 1300s. It was really tough, and, well, Western Europe was able to really continue to survive, and not just survive, but thrive. And it was because of this relative isolation, because once you get into Central Europe, especially Western Europe, you've got all these mountains, and you've got all this stuff in the way, and it's just really difficult to bring your army of horsemen all the way over into Germany, right? Like, it's a difficult thing to do. Now, yeah, so that's why Russia was really struggling to keep up with the West, because, the West, I think that's one of the contributing factors that made the West better off than Russia, but we can go more in depth on that another time. Now, Russia really wanted to industrialize. Now, in 1904, they fought a war with Japan. They got beat down. Russia, a white Christian country, lost to a non-Christian, non-white country. Now, at that point in time, that was like unheard of. That had like not happened for, it must have been like 1,000 years, probably more. It was unheard of. Didn't happen. Wasn't something that was supposed to happen. And they realized, oh, wow, this is because we have a really backwards economy. We have people eating dirt and people being malformed and, malnutrition and all this horrible stuff. And whoa, what do you know? It's hard to mobilize a society for war when everyone lives on a farm. It's really hard to hey, all you farmers, yeah, here's a gun. You don't have any bullets. The guy next to you has the bullets, and you're going to go fight this war. Like, not a winning strategy there, Russia. Not a winning strategy. And the reason that, France, the UK, Germany, the reason they could really compete with something like Russia, well, they were just more industrialized. They had better industry. They had more, they had more people working toward productive means. And those productive means, especially when it comes to transportation and weaponry and all that kind of stuff, even food, that translates really well into what can be used for war. Because if your country can take, okay, you got X amount of cars, okay, we got X amount of this, X amount of this, we can really use this for the military and things are going to be okay. But in Russia, they were really living medieval lifestyles, a lot of the peasants. The lower classes, that's just the way they lived. So they didn't really have all this stuff to give to the nation or, to give to the country to fight this war. Whereas in France, the UK, and Germany, they did. They had a lot to give. And Russia just didn't want to give people the liberty to be able to provide this kind of stuff. Because it's weird in a way. You give away power of your own to the people that you control, and then it makes you more powerful in turn. So you're trading a little bit of your national power for international power. And if Russia had embraced that early on, they probably would have kept up in a lot of ways. They probably wouldn't have lost to Japan, which was a horrible, humiliating defeat. Just look at the population size of the two places. The fact that Japan was able to win a war, against Russia, that's just insane. Honestly, the Tsar should have been embarrassed, because that's an embarrassing thing to happen. So, yeah. And the successful Western countries were just generally more progressive. They had governments that were maybe not entirely ruled by the people, but closer to being ruled by the people than it was in Russia. Because in Russia, man, it was just, the czar. The czar controlled the entire country. And it wasn't going to be without you had to have all these progressive reforms and liberal laws passed, and people have rights, and that makes for a powerful nation. If you can empower the individual, your nation is going to be more powerful. And that's just the way nation states work. The more regressive you are, well, the less powerful your country is going to be. Now look at something like, I think North Korea is even a good example. Because, you can I'm not sure you could call them progressive. They are definitely far left, but they are authoritarian and they are regressive as far as I'm concerned. And you look at what they do, the way they govern their people, well, it's really bad. It's bad for the people that live there. And it's also bad for the government because, well, they're like literally killing their own people. And it makes their own people worse off. And when you do that, when you take power away from individual people in your nation, you're taking away your own power. Now, I remember a couple days ago reading I think it was an article about the difference between North and South Korea. And in South Korea, they literally have an average IQ of like 10 points higher. And it's not because they're like, the South Koreans are just, naturally smarter than the North Koreans. No, that's not it. It's because the North Koreans don't get enough food. Their brains literally don't develop because of this regressive, demonic regime that controls everything. It's tragic. It is absolutely tragic. And it's just one of those things that it really demonstrates all of the problems of not embracing liberal Enlightenment value ideas. Because when you start to embrace those kinds of ideas, it generally turns in your favor. Look at the United States, for example. It was you could make the argument that it was the first country to have the people control the government. The first. And, well, look at America today. Now you can you could say, oh, it was luck, it was this or that, it was opportunism. You could say whatever you want. But, at the end of the day, the United States, I attribute the success of the United States to the fact that we have empowered individuals. And hopefully we can continue to empower individual people that live in the country. Because it makes for a more powerful country, makes for better individuals, just makes for life being better overall. And as more countries around the world adopt this kind of philosophy into the way they govern, it's just going to continue to be more like this. Thank you so much for watching all the way through. I really hope you guys enjoyed this presentation. And be sure to follow the podcast or subscribe to the YouTube channel if that's where you're listening/watching. Now, I want to let you guys know about a couple things. I have a couple documentaries on Amazon. Worked really hard on them. Some of them are about cryptids. Some of them are about the ocean. One of them is about Edgar Allan Poe. Some really good stuff. And if you guys have Amazon Prime, you can watch it for free. Some really great stuff. So be sure to check that out. Also, I want to let you know about Biocast, the biography podcast. It is, I would say that's my main focus online right now. And I take the life of one individual and I just give you that entire story. And it makes for some really good content because it allows you to understand history the way it should be through one individual human being. Because once you do that with enough people, you can really get a good grasp of the bigger events. Now, I have quite a few figures covered, pertaining to World War II. I've got Hitler, Stalin. I'm currently working on an episode about Leon Trotsky, and it is some fascinating research and work. And I really hope you guys check it out because I think it's just some really great, important work. And I hope you guys think so too. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Peace out.